April 18th, 1945. The war in Europe is almost over. Almost. But in the ruins of a nameless German village near the Elbe River, one final machine still roars. A Tiger I, 45 tons of steel, fear and engineering perfection, rolls through the smoke like a living fortress. Its armor is thicker than any shell the Allies can fire. Its gun can tear a Sherman tank in half at a mile. Its crew are veterans from the Eastern Front, men who've survived Stalingrad, Kursk, Normandy. And now, in the war's dying days, they're here to make one last stand. Facing them, 5 American soldiers, one broken 50-centimeter anti-tank gun, and Corporal Daniel O'Neal, a 22-year-old farmhand from Ohio who once spent his summers calculating the bounce of stones across a frozen pond. In the next 3 minutes, he will do what no manual teaches, what no general orders, and what physics itself says shouldn't be possible. He will kill the tiger, not by hitting it, but by missing it on purpose. The field at Elbe. At dawn, the sky over the Elbe glowed pale blue, the color of spent gunpowder. The river ran high with spring meltwater, swollen and fast, dragging branches and wreckage downstream. American units of the 69th Infantry Division were pushing toward the river, chasing the rumor of surrendering Germans and lost bridges. For most men, the war felt like it was ending, a machine slowly winding down after years of relentless motion. But not here, not yet. On the outskirts of a farming village named Kleinheide, Company E dug in for the night. The village was half ash, half mud, a place reduced to rubble by retreating artillery. The smell of diesel, earth and rot hung in the air. They had one anti-tank gun, a 57mm M1, light, old, worn down by months of constant firing. Its paint was blistered, its recoil spring cracked, its sight misaligned by a half-degree. But it was all they had. Corporal Daniel O'Neal inspected the weapon like a mechanic checks an engine. He was not a scholar, not an engineer, just a boy who knew angles. Before the war, he'd worked his father's fields outside Toledo, repairing tractors and plows, guessing soil grades by eye. War gave him metal instead of soil, and targets instead of furrows. His crew called him Doc, not for medicine, but for the way he diagnosed every problem like a doctor. He could read the recoil pattern of a gun and tell if the barrel was worn. He could smell a misfire before it happened. He didn't say much. He just fixed things. At 800 hours, their forward scout, Private Lester, returned with bad news. Through the morning fog, he'd seen it. A Tiger tank approaching from the East Road. Not a Panzer IV, not a Panther. A Tiger. O'Neal's stomach tightened. Everyone in Europe had heard of the Tiger. It wasn't a tank, it was a myth made of steel. The 60-mm KWK-36 gun could punch through Allied armor like paper. Its frontal plate was 100 millimeters thick. The American 57mm couldn't penetrate it, even at point-blank range. If you saw a Tiger, you didn't fight it. You hid, called artillery, prayed. But there was no artillery, no armor. Just 5 men, a single anti-tank gun and 24 shells. The road leading to the village was bordered by a stone wall, half destroyed by shell fire. Behind it stretched open farmland, soft, wet earth from spring rain. The perfect killing field for the Tiger, not for them. They positioned the gun facing the road, dug a shallow pit for the crew, camouflaged the barrel with branches. Private Boone muttered, "If that thing shows its nose, we're cooked." O'Neal just said, "Not yet." He studied the wall, the slope of the road, the soft rise beyond it. He crouched low, tracing lines in the dirt with a broken pencil stub. The others watched him like he'd gone mad. "Angle's wrong," he murmured. "If we shoot straight, we die. If we move, we die. But if we... Bounce it! Bounce it!" Boone asked. O'Neal looked up. "Ricochet. Off the wall," they laughed, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. The wall stood at a slight incline, 15 degrees facing the road. At that angle, a solid shot could deflect downward. And beneath the Tiger, hidden behind its monstrous armor, was its weakness. The belly plate, only 25 millimeters thick. O'Neal had read about it once in a captured German manual. It was an engineer's oversight, a trade-off between weight and mobility. No one was ever supposed to hit that angle. No one, until now. He measured by instinct. From gun to wall, 37 yards. From wall to the expected tiger position, another 60. He adjusted the elevation 12 mils lower than regulation and marked a new traverse line. His loader, Private Shaw, stared at him. "Danny, that's not regulation." "I know," O'Neal said. "Neither is dying." They loaded the first armor-piercing round. Solid shot, no explosive filler, maximum penetration. The crew waited in silence. The ground trembled. Somewhere beyond the mist they heard it, the low mechanical growl that no one could mistake. The tiger had arrived. The tiger arrives. At 09 and 17 hours, the mist began to move. It didn't lift. It drifted sideways, sliding like smoke between the shattered trees. The sound came first. A low metallic thunder, rhythmic, slow, heavy. Each gear change echoed off the stone ruins of Kleinheide like the heartbeat of a mechanical beast. The crew froze. Private Shaw whispered, "Christ! She's close." O'Neal didn't answer. He didn't look up. He just listened. He could tell distance from sound. That was something he'd learned long before the war. Standing in cornfields, counting seconds between lightning and thunder. He did the same now. 3 seconds from rumble to echo. 500 yards. 4 seconds. Closer. Through the haze, the first shape appeared. Tall, squared, unnatural. A Tiger Y, number 332, painted in late-war ambush camouflage. Green, brown, and tan, mottled with branches and dried mud. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a moving wall. The front armor glistened with dew, dark streaks running from bullet impacts that hadn't even scratched the paint. The tank commander, a young man in a black panzer uniform, stood in the open hatch, scanning the horizon with binoculars. He was confident, arrogant maybe. The tiger was his god, and gods don't fear mortals. The tank stopped near the crossroads at the village edge. Its engine idled, growling like an animal waiting to strike. Behind it came 2 smaller vehicles, a half-track and a Kubelwagen, probably a recon escort. They spread out along the road. The Tiger's turret turned slightly left, then right, sweeping the area. Inside the shallow gun pit, O'Neal's men crouched motionless. The world had shrunk to heartbeats and the soft creak of cooling metal. Boone licked his lips. "They see us, we're done." O'Neal nodded slightly. "That's why they won't." He shifted his eye to the sight, a fogged lens scratched from years of use. Through it, he could barely see the wall, just a grey blur. He adjusted the angle, 1 degree up, then back down. The traverse wheel creaked softly. He was calm, too calm, like he was tuning a piano instead of aiming a gun. The tiger began to move again, treads biting into the soft mud. Each rotation crushed the ground flat. It rolled past a burned-out house, over a fence, toward the open road where O'Neal's trap waited. "Range," he whispered. 75 yards. Closing, the loader's hands trembled slightly. O'Neal didn't look up. "Breathe." "Watch me," he counted under his breath. 3, 2. The tiger stopped. Its gun lowered slightly, scanning the fields ahead. They hadn't been spotted yet. But if the tank commander ordered even 1 high-explosive round into the hedgerow, the crew would be vaporized. Then came the sound no one wanted to hear. The slow whine of the tiger's turret traverse motor. The barrel was turning toward them. 10 degrees, 15-20. Boone hissed, "We're cooked, Danny." "Hold." O'Neal's finger rested on the firing lanyard. He wasn't looking at the tiger. He was looking at the wall. If the angle was wrong, the shell would deflect up, harmless. Too low, it would bury itself in the mud. There was 1 perfect point, 1 invisible intersection of math and luck. And he had to find it before they were spotted. At 70 yards, the tiger's main gun stopped moving. It was aimed directly at their hedgerow. The loader in the tiger's turret closed the breech. A moment later, the hiss of compressed air, clearing fumes. They were about to fire. "Now," O'Neal said quietly. "Fire." Shaw pulled the lanyard. The gun recoiled violently, throwing mud and smoke. The shell screamed across the field, struck the stone wall, and vanished. The Germans didn't even flinch. They thought it was a miss. But O'Neal was already watching the next half-second, the moment after impact. The shell hit the wall at an angle of roughly 14 degrees. The stone cracked, dust exploded outward, and the shell deflected down, exactly as he'd guessed, into the wet earth beneath the Tiger. There was a flash, then a dull, heavy concussion that lifted the front end of the tank 2 feet off the ground. A second later, fire. The Tiger's lower hull erupted in smoke and sparks. One tread snapped, whipping through the air like a steel serpent. The turret froze mid-rotation. For the first time, the crew inside screamed. The Americans stared, unable to believe what they'd just seen. O'Neal didn't move. He just said, "Load." Shaw slammed another round in. Boone laughed hysterically, his nerves snapping all at once. "You hit it! You crazy bastard, you hit it!" O'Neal ignored him. "Again," he ordered. He wasn't celebrating. He knew the Tiger wasn't dead yet. The gun fired again, this time straight into the smoking gap under the hull. A deep roar followed, the fuel fire, then the sharp pop of ammunition cooking off. The Tiger's turret spun once violently before jamming. The commander tried to climb out of the hatch. Flames took him halfway through, then silence. Smoke rolled across the road like a wave. The Tiger burned, orange and black, its shadow flickering on the stone wall that had betrayed it. For a moment, no one moved. It felt unreal, like watching a god bleed. Then Boone whispered, "We did it," and O'Neal finally exhaled. He looked at the wall, still crumbling from the impact, and said quietly, "No, the math did it." At 09:25, the Tiger's explosion echoed across the valley. Units 2 kilometers away reported hearing it. They assumed an artillery strike. No one guessed that a 5-man crew with an obsolete gun had just killed the strongest tank in the world with a ricochet shot. When infantry advanced through the village an hour later, they found the Tiger still burning. Its armor plate was split along the lower hull, a wound caused by a deflected shell that entered at the exact angle where its armor was weakest. The investigators couldn't explain it. The physics didn't add up, but O'Neal never explained it either. He just smiled when they asked. "Sometimes," he said, "you don't aim where they are. You aim where they think you can't reach, the shot that shouldn't exist." War rarely pauses for astonishment. But on that morning near Kleinheide, time seemed to stop. The Tiger burned, and no one could understand how. The field was silent except for the low hiss of fire and the slow crackle of cooling steel. Even the birds had fled. The crew of the American gun just stared. Their faces were blackened with soot, their ears ringing. Boone sat down hard in the mud, laughing in disbelief. "Jesus Christ, Danny, we bounced it. We actually bounced it." O'Neal didn't answer. He was still watching the tank. He didn't trust silence. Not here, not yet. Inside the Tiger, heat built like a furnace. The radio operator had died instantly when the first ricochet breached the belly plate. The loader's leg was crushed by shrapnel. The gunner had tried to elevate the turret, but the hydraulics were gone. The Tiger's interior was a tomb of smoke, fire, and screams. Through the commander's hatch, black smoke poured like blood. A single shape tried to climb free, his uniform burning, and fell into the road. Then nothing moved. O'Neal waited 30 seconds more before standing. He wiped grime from his face with a shaking hand. That was when the reality of what had happened began to settle. Not triumph, not pride, but the cold edge of comprehension. He had just beaten a machine that was never meant to lose. The others gathered around the gun. Shaw checked the barrel, no cracks. Boone kept glancing at the Tiger, as if expecting it to rise again. Private Lester whispered, "That shot shouldn't even exist." O'Neal nodded once. "Yeah, it shouldn't. The math of the impossible, the M157 Liptiller gun, was not designed for miracles. It was a British design, the 6-pounder, adopted by the US early in the war. By 1945, it was outdated, underpowered, and overshadowed by larger 76mm and 90mm guns. Its muzzle velocity was 2,800 feet per second, fast, but not fast enough to penetrate a Tiger's 100mm frontal plate. A direct shot would have flattened like a coin, but ricochet angles, Those were unpredictable. In theory, a shell could deflect at a shallow angle, maintaining velocity if the surface was hard enough and the rotation stable. But stone walls were irregular. The odds of a deflection maintaining trajectory were 1 in 1,000. For the shell to strike the underside of the tiger, it needed to hit the wall between 12 and 16 degrees, deflect downward between 22 and 28 degrees, and maintain more than 900 feet per second of speed after impact. No manual accounted for that. No test range measured it. It was like throwing a stone across a lake and skipping it under a boat. But O'Neal had seen it before, not in war, but on the farm. When he was 16, he and his brother used to shoot tin cans with a .22 rifle. Once by accident, a round had bounced off the frozen pond and hit a target behind them. His father had grounded them for a week. But O'Neal never forgot the angle. He'd replayed it in his mind hundreds of times. The way ice, distance, and pressure created a perfect reflection. Now, years later, that memory had returned. In a war, in the mud, with lives on the line. A childhood accident had become a battlefield calculation. He looked down at the cracked wall, its surface chipped where the shell had struck. The angle was nearly perfect. 15 degrees, maybe a little more, enough to make the impossible real. Boone crouched beside him. "How'd you even think to try that?" O'Neal shrugged. "Didn't think. Just saw it. That was the truth." He hadn't run an equation. He'd seen the geometry, the way the line of fire met the wall, the way the wall met the ground. It wasn't mathematics in his mind. It was shape and rhythm, the way a plow cuts the earth, the way water bends light. To him, war wasn't about strategy. It was about patterns inside the tiger. For hours after the battle, the tiger burned. When the smoke finally thinned, infantry moved in. A young lieutenant from the 273rd Regiment wrote the after-action notes: "Enemy tiger tank disabled by direct and/or indirect fire. Cause of destruction undetermined. Possible mine or internal explosion." He didn't mention a ricochet. No one would have believed it anyway. When engineers examined the wreck, they found something strange. The point of entry wasn't in the side or the front. It was underneath. A jagged hole, 8 inches wide, torn through the bottom armor plate. Traces of stone dust and metal embedded in the wound. It was impossible to explain, but the Germans who had survived, the half-track crew that had been following, later confirmed what they saw. A flash from the ground. A shell that came up instead of down. A tiger destroyed by its own shadow. After the fire, by midday, word had spread through the company. A single anti-tank crew had killed a tiger. The story changed with every retelling. Some said O'Neal hit the turret ring. Others said he fired straight through the front plate. No one mentioned the wall, because no one wanted to believe that luck or instinct had beaten the most feared machine of the war. That evening, O'Neal sat alone by the gun. The others were celebrating, cleaning their weapons, sharing what was left of the rations. He stayed behind, staring at the broken wall and the crater beneath the tiger. He replayed the moment in his head over and over again. Not pride, not relief, just disbelief. He knew he'd never replicate it. He wasn't sure he'd even try. When his sergeant came by, he found O'Neal still sitting there. "Hell of a shot," the sergeant said. O'Neal just nodded. "Lucky one." The sergeant grinned. "Luck doesn't hit like that." O'Neal looked back toward the field. "No, it doesn't. But it helps when you've been practicing since you were 12. The quiet recognition." 3 days later, the division crossed the Elbe. O'Neal's unit was rotated to reserve. No one wrote about Kleinheide in the official record. It was just one of thousands of nameless skirmishes in the final days of the war. But within the company, the story became legend. Doc O'Neal, they called him. The man who bounced a shot into a tiger. The man who used geometry instead of luck. When the war ended, O'Neal didn't go to parades or interviews. He went home, back to Ohio, back to his fields, back to soil instead of steel. He worked tractors again, repaired engines, raised 3 children. never mentioned the wall, but years later, when his grandson asked him what he'd done in the war, he said, "On math, I just did the math. Geometry of survival." War is rarely about who has the bigger gun. It's about who understands how to use what's left. Corporal Daniel O'Neal didn't think in terms of heroism or orders. He thought in shapes, arcs, lines, reflections. In his mind, survival had geometry. That day at Kleinheide, he hadn't outgunned the tiger. He'd outthought it. The art of angles. Every soldier learns the same doctrine. See the target, aim, fire, adjust, repeat until something explodes. But doctrine assumes perfect conditions. Stable ground, clear line of sight, cooperative physics. The battlefield offers none of those things. O'Neal had learned to fight in places where the manual didn't apply. Flooded fields, half-collapsed barns, forests so dense the sky disappeared. Every obstacle was a new equation. Every survival was proof of adaptation. He used to say that combat was just farm math. You don't calculate, you feel it. You know when a slope will carry water or when a plow will bite too deep. You learn by the weight in your hands, the sound in the soil, the tilt of the horizon. War in his eyes was just the same field, only louder. So when he saw that stone wall, his brain didn't think cover, it thought surface. Something that could redirect energy, just like how a plow blade turns soil or a stone skips off a pond. He wasn't guessing. He was translating instinct into geometry. That instinct had saved him. Improvisation as discipline. After the battle, one of the regimental officers tried to debrief him. He wanted to know how O'Neal had calculated the angle, what formula, what measurement, what rangefinder he'd used. O'Neal just smiled and said, "There wasn't time to think that way." The officer didn't understand. He called it reckless improvisation. But O'Neal's kind of improvisation wasn't recklessness. It was discipline applied to chaos. He knew the 57mm muzzle velocity. He knew the ground's moisture content from the way his boots sank. He knew the wall's composition, limestone mixed with clay mortar, by the way it crumbled under his touch. He didn't need equations. He had experience. To an outsider, it looked like madness. To him, it was inevitability. The Germans' last stand. 2 days later, the division intelligence section interrogated prisoners from the same armored unit. One of them, a wounded German loader from the Tiger platoon, confirmed the story. The Americans had no tanks. We thought the road was clear. Then there was one shot. It hit the ground and came up. It was not possible. It hit under us. The tank lifted. The engine died. We thought it was a mine, but there was no mine. He added something else. Our commander said once, "No one kills a tiger from the front." Maybe they didn't. Maybe they killed it from below. The irony wasn't lost on the Americans. The tiger's reputation had terrified Allied troops for years, and it ended not with a massive artillery barrage or a swarm of tanks, but with a deflected round from a worn-out field gun. Physics and luck later. After the war, engineers at Aberdeen Proving Ground tried to recreate the shot. They built a mock wall at 15 degrees, fired a 57mm solid shot into it from 40 yards. Every time the shell shattered, buried, or deflected off target. None of them replicated the Kleinheide hit. The report concluded, such a ricochet resulting in destructive effect would require exceptional alignment and angle coincidence, effectively impossible under combat conditions. The phrase effectively impossible became O'Neal's quiet joke. He'd done the impossible once. That was enough. The psychology of the shot. When soldiers talk about bravery, they often describe action. Charging, shooting, rescuing. But O'Neal's courage was something quieter, the ability to act in stillness. He'd been calm not because he was fearless, but because he understood the alternative. Fear made hands shake. Shaking hands ruin angles. In that instant, when everyone else saw death, he saw data. He could hear the tiger's treads, time the gap between each link's impact, predict the moment the hull would align with the wall. He had no stopwatch, no instruments, only a mind trained to notice. That's what war does to certain men. It doesn't make them braver. It makes them sharper. Every detail becomes a number. Every second, an equation of survival. Parallel fronts across Europe. Similar stories unfolded in the war's final months. Small, forgotten acts of innovation that never reached the headlines. A Soviet anti-tank gunner outside Breslau once fired through a railway signal mirror to reflect a shot into the side of a panther. A British sapper in Arnhem used a bicycle chain to trip a tiger's tracks. A Polish resistance fighter in Warsaw redirected mortar fire using an iron door hinge as a sight. Different men, same logic, adaptation beyond doctrine. O'Neal never met them. He probably never heard their names. But they all shared the same philosophy. When manuals fail, instinct takes command, doctrine versus reality. After the war, American military analysts wrote thousands of pages on anti-tank tactics. They emphasized firepower, coordination, and technology. But buried in the archives was one line from an obscure field report, unsigned, typed on a manual typewriter, probably by a junior officer who'd been there that morning. Corporal O'Neal displayed adaptive use of ricochet geometry under field conditions, resulting in successful enemy armor neutralization. Technique not doctrinally reproducible. That was how history recorded it. 6 words of praise, 3 words of dismissal. Not doctrinally reproducible. In military language, that means we can't teach this. And that's exactly why it mattered. Doctrine builds soldiers who follow. Improvisation saves those who think. The cost of precision. O'Neal didn't consider himself a hero. He never spoke at reunions. He rarely wrote letters about the war. But those who served with him remembered one thing: how he prepared every shot like a craftsman, not a killer. He used to say, "You can't rush precision. You can only ruin it." To him, firing a gun wasn't about power. It was about alignment. He cleaned his weapon like a ritual, never out of superstition, but because he respected the math behind the mechanism. Every screw, every spring, every variable mattered. He understood something few did, that in war, accuracy is empathy turned inside out. The more precisely you understand destruction, the more you grasp its weight. Memory in metal. In 1956, American engineers tested surviving Tiger tanks at Fort Knox. They studied every angle, every vulnerability. But when they analyzed a specific destroyed hull recovered from the Elbe region, they found something unique: a blast hole in the lower plate lined with limestone dust. They had no explanation. The report noted, "This vehicle appears to have been destroyed by an indirect glancing impact producing upward trajectory. Statistical probability less than 0.001. No one connected it to O'Neal. No one had to. The numbers spoke for themselves. Legacy of thought. Years later, a young artillery instructor at Fort Sill came across that line. Upward trajectory, less than 0.01 probability. He used it in lectures to teach a single lesson: technology changes. Physics doesn't. And every weapon ever made is only as smart as the man who aims it. He called it the O'Neal principle, unofficially, quietly. It wasn't in any manual, but whispered through the barracks. If you can't see the way forward, find the angle no one else sees. The moment of silence. The Tiger stopped burning by nightfall. The flames sank into smoke, the smoke into mist, and the mist into the same silence that had preceded everything. The crew of the 57 stayed awake, though the battle was long over. No one spoke much. They just listened. To the wind, to the crack of cooling metal, to the occasional pop of distant gunfire somewhere across the river. It was the sound of a world ending slowly. Boone sat near the barrel, his hands black with soot. "Think anyone'll believe it?" he asked. O'Neal shrugged. "They'll believe the tank's gone." That's enough. For him, belief wasn't the point. The Tiger was gone. His men were alive. The math had balanced. He leaned against the cold earth and stared at the stars. For the first time in years, he could see them, not through smoke or firelight, but through clean open air. The Big Dipper, Orion's Belt, the same constellations he'd used to navigate tractors back home when headlights failed. He smiled faintly. War had stripped everything away, rank, youth, fear, but not the part of him that saw patterns in chaos. That, he realized, was what survival meant. Not strength, understanding the battlefield. After the storm at dawn, medics came for the German bodies. The Tiger's hull had twisted from the internal explosion, tracks melted into the road. Its gun pointed uselessly toward the horizon, as if searching for something it could never reach. One medic paused by the commander's body. His burned hand still clutched a pair of binoculars. In his pocket, they found a map of the area, with every American position neatly marked. He had known exactly where O'Neal's gun was. He just hadn't expected the angle. War is strange that way. Sometimes you can see the whole battlefield and still miss the one thing that matters. The weight of victory. By mid-morning, new orders came. The company would move out, cross the Elbe, link up with Soviet forces within the week. The war was nearly over. The men cheered quietly, but O'Neal didn't join them. He stayed behind a moment longer, checking the gun, wiping the breech, closing the ammo box. He touched the cracked sight. Still fogged, still off by half a degree. It had been wrong from the start, and somehow that imperfection had saved them. He thought about that. How something broken had found its purpose. Private Shaw called from the truck. "Danny, let's go." "We made it." O'Neal gave one last glance to the field, the shattered wall, the crater where steel met stone, and said softly, "Yeah, we made it." Aftermath and legacy. The war ended 19 days later. Germany surrendered. Flags changed. Maps redrew. But memory doesn't surrender. For years afterward, the story of Kleinheide drifted through veteran circles like a rumor. Some said it was luck. Others said it was divine. But for those who'd been there, it was something else. Proof that even in a world built on destruction, creation could still exist. O'Neal went home. The army offered him a commendation, but he never attended the ceremony. He didn't want a medal for one shot. He wanted silence. He got it. In the fields of Ohio, where corn grew taller than the echoes of war, he worked with his hands again, fixing tractors, building engines, mending broken tools. Whenever something didn't fit, he'd mutter, "There's always another angle." Neighbors thought it was just a saying. Only his crew, the few who lived long enough to remember, knew what it meant. It was his way of talking about that day without talking about it. The ricochet, the impossible shot. The geometry that saved 5 lives and ended 1 myth. Forgotten steel. In 1968, a team of historians cataloguing wrecks near the Elbe discovered the remains of a Tiger hull half buried in a meadow. Its number plate read 332. Inside were rusted shells, melted glass, and a hole clean through the lower armor. They noted it as damage from possible mine detonation. The report was filed, stamped, and forgotten, but one of the photographers, an old war enthusiast, took a private picture. In the frame, the light cut perfectly through the torn plate, revealing a patch of white stone embedded deep in the metal, a piece of that same wall from Kleinheide. The stone that turned a farmhand's guess into a legend, the quiet passing when. Daniel O'Neal died in 1983. His family found an old cigar box in his workshop. Inside were 2 spent shell casings, a folded map of Germany, and a single photograph. 5 men standing by a burned tank, smoke still rising behind them. No caption, no date. Just a faint penciled line at the bottom, angle of life. At his funeral, a few old soldiers came, men with medals, scars, and memories too heavy for words. They stood together, looked at his photograph, and one of them said quietly, "He didn't just fire the gun. He found the line none of us could see." The last ricochet. War ends in silence, but stories echo. Sometimes they bounce, off time, off memory, off history, just like that shell at Kleinheide. Every generation has its tigers, machines too strong to fight, problems too vast to solve. But somewhere there is always someone like O'Neal, a mechanic, a thinker, a quiet observer, who sees the world not in fear, but in angles. He reminds us that precision isn't perfection, it's adaptation, that the strongest armor can be undone by the smallest insight. And that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just calculates. As the years pass, the tiger rusts. The wall crumbles. The field becomes quiet again. But the line that O'Neal drew through that morning, from broken stone to burning steel, remains, invisible yet exact, a perfect equation between instinct and survival. Because even when the noise fades, some shots never stop echoing, they just keep bouncing forever.